All right, and we're back, everybody, after a brief break. And Andrew Hinton is next on deck. The um, presentation title and mini background here: the body electric, finding ground in our new digital reality. And with that, I will hand it over to Andrew for his presentation.
Great. Thanks a lot, Shane. Let me fumble once more through remembering how to click the right screen. There we go. I did it this time. And all right. Awesome. Is that working?
Looking good.
Okay, great. Thanks for saying that because I can't see anything now. Um, cool. Okay, well, hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be joining you on this amazing day when we get to share with each other about this thing we do. My talk is called The Body Electric, Finding Ground in Our New Digital Reality. And I will start. So evidently I was asked to speak today in part because I wrote this book a while back, and it happens to be about this year's theme. Honestly, I can't believe it's almost 10 years old. This little green bee eater on the cover is really growing up, eating lots of bees. In researching and writing this book, I experienced a kind of Copernican revolution, a flip of the world in my own brain that kind of forever changed how I think about this work, and the people who use the products and services that I'm part of architecting and designing. And one key lesson that really has sunk in even more for me since is related is behind the title of this talk, which is that the lesson that the human body is not just a context to be considered among many. It is the context from which all human contexts emerge, because our bodies are the mechanisms evolution has provided us to survive through engaging and understanding our surroundings. And we survive by perceiving the information that our senses pick up from the way energy, light, sound, heat, etc., react with the surfaces and objects of that environment. And what we think of as human cognition is a function of this relationship. The environment and our body's nervous systems are inextricably enmeshed as we perceive in order to act and act in order to perceive. The literal ground that orients all of this activity is the terrestrial surface we evolved upon. And in this case, you could say that all information starts with the fact that our bodies exist in a gravitational field pulling us toward the ground. This fundamental mechanism of our existence makes its way into our language when we speak of being well-grounded, meaning stable, firm, or rooted, or versus ungrounded, disconnected, abstracted, untethered, disoriented. We can't really engage how context works for humans without starting with these first principles. The information that we contemporary humans rely upon, though, isn't just about standing on the ground and touching rocks. We've got lots of other things going on, right? It's not just about the physical affordances of nature. And it turns out there's not just one way to define what information is. There are multiple theoretical frameworks for what information is, and no single one of them is the only right answer. So I took a pluralistic approach by using an informal conceptual model, and I'm going to stress it's informal and conceptual, to describe information in three forms or modes. And it's been a long time since I publicly spoke on this, so let me just walk through it because it gives this, we returned to this a few times. So physical information is the stuff that I mentioned in the last slide. It's what our bodies use to perceive, touch, and use the physical objects and surfaces of the world. And it's what our body's nervous systems use as the foundation of human cognition. Everything else that defines what it means to live as a human being starts with the mechanics of bodies and environments. Semantic information is what we create with language, whether spoken or written or gestured. With the book icon here, I'm emphasizing writing because that's where humans first started separating speech from bodies and storing it instead in physical media by encoding oral speech into symbols inscribed on durable surfaces. Okay, so this invention, from cave paintings to styluses and clay tablets to books and newspapers, forever changed how humans use and think about language and semantic information. Now that or note that both of the physical and the semantic information are, in a sense, embodied in terms of how we perceive and understand them and touch and work with them. Just as we can touch the ground under our feet, we can touch a papyrus, a clay tablet, a book, or even a microfiche. And the semantic information inscribed upon these things, we can see with our bodies, right? We can observe it. And as long as we understand how to read, right? How to turn those visual things we're seeing into sounds that mean words in our heads or saying them out loud, then it is human readable, right? There's no obscuring going on other than just knowing how to read it. Additionally, it exists as physical media. Okay, so think about the fact that, like, to copy it, right? This is, back in the olden days, in the before times, some of you may not remember, you couldn't just copy something over and over again that easily like you can digitally, right? You actually had to, like, make carbon copies or make Xerox copies or whatever. And often, like, the copies weren't even as good as the original. I mean, it was just, there was inertia involved in copying something or using it in a different context. But that's really changed, because if you think about what happened when we started digitizing all this content, we separated it from its human readable physical media and turned it into bits and bytes. And I really think that we are all still coming to grips as a species with the implication of this innovation. In the grand scheme of things, we haven't been doing it that long. And a lot of the technological advances we're seeing now, really are leveraging this, right? The fact that you can just move information in massive quantities wherever you want with some costs, which, we can touch on later. But digital information is weirder than the other two, right? Because it was invented by people like Claude Shannon as a way to translate semantic information into something that allows us to accurately store and communicate it across vast distances at incredible speed. But that required transforming human readable semantic information into patterns of electrons optimized for machines. And because raw digital information is fundamentally not human readable, these atomized bits then have to be reconstituted by the same machines or similar machines into their original human readable semantic form. So in a way, that translation, right, okay, you're going to put some human readable things into the machine, and the machine has to turn it into these completely unhuman readable bits of electrons on media so that it can work with it, and it has to translate it back, is a sort of fractal microcosm to me of the broader challenge of how humans interact with digital systems. And I think that's relevant to us today, in part because this need for translation, right? This translation of human body to completely disembodied thing, at least in terms of the information in it as it relates to humans. This bridge, right, is really the work that we do. This need for translation of information and affordances between digital systems and human users is really most of what we are doing in the various disciplines that contribute to user experience. And for information architecture in particular, so much of our practice is about creating these semantic structures, signifiers and moving parts, the labels, relationships, and rules as the bridge that makes semantic and digital systems understandable and usable. As practitioners, we should be concerned with how this translation works and whether or not we're remaining connected to the physical mode, to the bodies that we expect to touch the things we make. And I, for one, am a little worried that things are not taking a great turn. Specifically, my concern is that the ongoing trend really is toward empowering the feedback loop between semantic information and the ways digital technology can make use of that information, without much concern for the human lives that may be ignored or harmed in the process. And let's be frank, there are huge financial incentives behind this trend. I mean, bodies are inefficient, they're expensive, they're messy, complex, and demanding. From a purely financial perspective, bodies are best optimized as consumers who pay for what they consume, but they're expensive as workers or creators. So what if we could just cut them out of the production entirely? So this is awkward because we just had a talk, right? Touching on artificial intelligence. But I'm going to mention as we go, there's some differences between what we heard a minute ago and some of the other things I'm going to be touching on. So anyway, just putting that out there. Didn't want to be rude. There's perhaps no better present example of this trend than the new generation of generative artificial intelligence technologies, ChatGPT, OpenAI, DALL-E, etc. Clearly, there are many points of view about these automated content generators. This isn't the place to get into all those arguments, but they do have some clearly problematic issues when it comes to context. Let's start with the label itself. And of course, artificial intelligence as a label has been around for a long time, not just since the advent of OpenAI and its kin. But starting here, right? We know that artificial means it's something human-made or made by something that's human-made. It mimics the qualities or behaviors of something in nature, but it's not from nature. So that's fine. Okay, got it. But what about intelligence? And it turns out, intelligence is a lot like art or peace or love. It's an abstraction that doesn't have a single example that defines it entirely. And it's highly dependent on the context in which it is used. For one thing, it's not like scientists and philosophers and others haven't tried to define this over the ages. Here, Dagmar Monette, the computer scientist, shares in a presentation how leading psychologists tried to define it in the 80s. And they kind of had to go meta and kind of throw their hands up and say, well, it's kind of all over the place. It's elusive, it's illusory, it's polymorphous, it's pluralistic, it's context dependent, it's a societal construct, and on and on. And this isn't to say that there's no useful way to define it. It's just that there's no one way to define it. At least not in a way that's directly applicable, right? Like it really depends on the specific context that you're talking about in terms of, well, what do we mean about intelligence in this situation? And that's why I really like this framing from Rita Bliss in her book, Rethinking Intelligence, which is defining it as learning from our environments and the awareness of learning opportunities in our environments. And there's more to it than that, of course, but that's the umbrella. And what I love about this is that it bakes this realization that intelligence is highly contextual right into its language by admitting that intelligence isn't just one set of behaviors, rather it's bound up into particulars of what a specific organism or person needs from their environment and how successfully they utilize their nervous system and the rest of their body to meet those needs. Dr. Bliss's motivation in spreading the new scientific consensus on intelligence isn't just academic. She's trying to get the broader culture to understand that real harms come to people because of the biases embedded in how we use measures of supposed intelligence in our educational, medical, governmental, and economic systems. Because there's nearly infinite variety among human beings, our bodies, our personalities, our knowledge, our beliefs, and yet many of the social systems we engage with and depend upon, economic, educational, religious, so on, they can't really account for every uniqueness. So they have to kind of round up that variety into categories, especially when we're talking about anything at scale, right? That's trying to work with great numbers of people in some way. So they have to use statistical models, such as bell curves, to map the territory of human life and humans themselves. And as we know, maps and models are inherently incomplete ways to describe the world. And all maps and models have agendas, whether they were explicitly intended or not, because they have to be limited. Otherwise you're just recreating the whole universe. But their limitations are also what provide their utility and their explanatory power, right? So it's a necessary trade-off, but it comes with risks. It's important to understand those risks. And when you're employing these things, like what are you leaving out and what biases might you be introducing? And this is a people say this a lot, but it's worth bringing up here. Korzybski's good old general semantics statement that the map is not the territory it describes, and the word we use for a thing is not the thing itself. And every time I hear this, I'm like, well, yeah, duh, of course. But Korzybski felt compelled to say this because it's human nature to fall prey to the cognitive fallacy where we drift away from the territory and its real things, and we make decisions based on the models and maps, right? These reified sets of heuristics and assumptions that we create, which is, again, natural. It's just the way cognition helps us survive. If we had to think deeply and analyze deeply every single step we take in the world, we'd starve. So you can't do it all the time, right? But you always have to be checking in. And I don't know that there's enough checking in going on sometimes. But anyway, if we drift away from this, right, then we may not account for some critically important factors in the real world where bodies are on the ground. So what happens when we mistake our maps for territories? When we foreground our models and background the real human bodies and human artifacts those models are about? If we're not careful, we can become too enamored of these schema and mistake them for the variety of the actual human bodies and lives we're mapping. So we end up with averages of averages, maps of maps, models of models, which naturally results in an even more narrow bucket everyone has to contort themselves into or be left out entirely. I mean, we're seeing this with things like these awful like personality quizzes and stuff that you see on like job application sites and stuff like that, right? Like the model behind it is one, mysterious and proprietary, so you don't really know how it works, and neither does the employer that has licensed it usually. And two, like it's just churning people up, and then there's nobody to turn to, there's nobody to talk to. It's just one example of how just people are just getting left out, right, with these models. And of course, it's a concern when you're starting to say, like, when you hear the Pentagon or giant hospital networks are starting to license these models. Okay, well, how what are we leaving out, right? What is the model assuming? We've seen this in many places in human life. For example, this kind of famous chart that's gone around, it kind of went viral a couple of times recently. Biologically speaking, there's no way there was a lower percentage of left-handed people in 1900, but the conventionally accepted model for human behavior pathologized left-handedness. As the conventional model changed and people started to become more accepting of it, the percentage changed as people felt safe identifying and behaving as left-handed. We've seen this chart used as an example to answer similar questions about gender, neurodivergence, and sexual identity. Of course, these biases are absorbed and utilized in our civic infrastructure. That's going on forever before they were even computers. We look at redlining laws, for example, for I don't know, century or more. We've long known that prejudice is easily encoded into any classification scheme, and we know that it does terrible harm to anyone not passing as a member of a privileged class. And yet, we can't help but try to automate these systems. As we remove human bodies from our systems, the promise is that we gain speed, efficiency, while also gaining personal freedom from drudgery. But somehow, especially for a lot of the more working or kind of pink collar class, so to speak, there's always more drudgery to add to the day. It doesn't seem to go away. It's just faster and more efficient for somebody. But what are we losing, right, when we automate? There are mountains of commentary and research about this question. I don't have anything especially new to add to that general discourse, but for information architecture, really anybody doing anything around user experience practice, I wonder if we are asking this question enough. And one problem with the automation dream is, again, there's a kind of reified, like cargo cult kind of mentality that can go into it, where it's like, the engineers and the product people or whoever that are trying to do some of these things, just they're only looking at the surface of what's happening. Or we can make a machine do that, but they're not understanding like all of the sort of root system underneath of like human context and human communication and everything else that actually makes some of these things work properly. We seem to think that we can automate things that actually don't work that great as automations, or at least as well as we thought they would. And I can't help but believe that there's just a huge blind spot at work here, where a lot of assumptions are being made by people who maybe don't do the work themselves or haven't done it in a long time about the human skills and deeply complex social interactions that enable many of our most mundane daily labors. A story recently actually came out, I can't remember which of the big magazines it came, but it was about Rebecca Solnit about self-driving cars or automated cars, right? And just going into the kind of the ethnographic reality of how when you're driving and you're at like a four-way stop, there's a lot of like semantic information, right, in real time with bodies being exchanged, through windshields and stuff. Oh, you go, no, I'll go, right? Because nobody ever seems to remember the rule about like which stop sign should go first. There's so many situations like that there's somehow the technological mindset just doesn't see that stuff. It thinks that that's the noise that it's somehow bypassing, when in fact that's the stuff that actually makes a lot of this work. ChatGPT, OpenAI, and its other general purpose cousins are maybe the quintessence of the trend toward disembodiment. because we can't trace their output back to any specific inputs. Now, again, I'm talking here about the fact that, you know, you had organizations that decided we're going to create this this body of knowledge in a way that and we're going to push it out there, right? And now that it's out there, well, that's it's part of the world now, and everybody's having to figure out how to use it because there's competition. Everybody's got to figure it out, right? But the original decisions behind some of this got made. I'm really scratching my head about, because, you know, the inputs are not just obscured, they're kind of obliterated. These models were built by inhaling everything on the open web, regardless of copyright or creator preference, pumped into a silicon wood chipper that eats more water and power than many whole countries, which are countries and water and power that people with bodies depend on, then reconstituted an uncanny valley pastiche designed to be convincing, if not necessarily good or true. And without any real disclaimers about their limitations, they were turned loose on an unsuspecting public with the promise that it's a generally applicable tool for almost anything a user could dream of doing with whatever that user thinks an artificial intelligence is for, right? And so you immediately saw people using it for things that were completely inappropriate for the tool. You know, lawyers turning in, you know, legal briefs to judges that had citations that don't actually exist. And of course, yeah, you could say, well, maybe that's you know, just professional malpractice, and it is, but like, if you, hey, look, a lawyer isn't necessarily a you know, an AI expert, right? If they're being sold a bill of goods, they're like, I can ask this a question and it's just going to give me answers, then that's how I'm going to use it. But really, it's a map maker with no territory to compare its output to. It's just like creating a map from other maps when you never checked if the source maps are accurate to begin with, but then you trust that the average of what all those random maps in the world say will somehow be a good enough result. Emily Bender, who will be the keynote speaker at this year's IA conference, which I am just terribly disappointed I won't be able to attend this year, is one of a number of scholars taking an activist stance, calling out the huge blind spots playing out in our AI hype cycle. What she calls the danger zone for machine learning tech solutionism is the lack of ability to validate their truth or even their origins. These are disembodied products producing disembodied information made of recycled corpses of everything humanity has expressed online and then fed back to human bodies for subscription fees. This is what's known in the tech biz as a business model. But at what point did this business model account for the human bodies it would impact? At what point will it ever? There is precedent. Medicine shows and snake oil salesmen used to peddle potions with mysterious ingredients and questionable provenance. And while it's true that some of the ingredients had appropriate beneficial uses in specific contexts, and of course there were also people making medicines that were completely ethical and very specific to specific needs, right? But there was this big market opportunity in implying or outright promising it could cure almost any malady. And if someone thought it might cure something that we didn't get around to listing on the label, well, why disabuse them of that notion as long as they buy more? But most of these cocktails were actually full of opiates and alcohol, which, by the way, neither of which is inherently bad, but again, used for the right purpose, which made people feel like they were getting a benefit, even if somebody was getting harmed. Now, again, let me reiterate, I do believe there are generative AI like products, right, that are ethically labeled and just like ethically prescribed and labeled medicines with pure ingredients, with traceable origins, you know, those exist and they can be powerful and great tools. And I'm looking forward to using them myself and figuring out how to use them. But just as with medicines, ethical products only exist because the creators care about and understand the human bodies who consume them. Personally, I think caring about human impact of what your AI model uses as both inputs and outputs is a major differentiator in the marketplace. I would encourage any service provider who doesn't use stolen source material, who has traceability and transparency built into their product, to heavily advertise those as features. I feel compelled to point out that much of the most incisive and well-researched criticism of AI overhype is coming from women and especially women of color. I don't think it can be said enough that those of us who benefit from unearned privilege are maybe not the best experts when it comes to the benefits versus harms equation of new powerful tech. We need to listen to the people who have had to live through systemic inequities because their context of lived experience with bodies and lives that don't fit the heavily biased bell curve average certainly has lessons for all of us. So I've been picking on AI, but only as a recent high-profile example of a broader dynamic. We see it in our social media platforms where owners are selling out their users' online lives to data brokers. And so-called engagement is tracked not in terms of human fulfillment, but statistics to drive ad dollars. We see it in private equity markets where successful businesses are bought and used as kindling to reward shareholders who have no interest in the well-being of the human bodies their decisions affect. We see it in the continuing layoff cycles where thousands of human bodies are being pushed out into the cold, not because their employer is losing money, but because of social contagion and shareholder pressure from C-suite class. Of course, this is not a new pattern in human life. It's as old as social hierarchy. But digital technology feels, I don't know, it feels like it's making it even more impersonal and able to be executed en masse and in a different way that I'm still wrapping my head around. We don't have to look at big news stories about corporate giants to see these dynamics in play either. I'm sure most of us have experienced a more everyday version where our workplaces make decisions that leave us scratching our heads. The more insulated a group becomes from the people their actions affect, the more risk there is that their actions will affect those people badly. It is human nature to lose touch with what you're no longer in touch with. I say the word touch because actually having in-person experience of other human bodies is categorically different from just keeping up with statistics and spreadsheets about those humans. So many decisions that impact people are made based on data extruded from data, interpreted by an algorithm without looking into the nuanced context of its origins. I've sat through many meetings in corporate meeting rooms over the years where people are making decisions based on breathing their own exhaust. Assumptions synthesized from prior assumptions, wrapped up in some charts with questionable axes, and a collective fervent belief that we know what the customer wants. As we pump out more products and features that make the human environment ever more complex, it gets harder to keep it all connected to ground, to the specific, unique needs of the many human bodies who rely on that environment and the technological interventions we introduce to it. But that only makes finding that ground more important. People are pretty simple creatures after all. They just want to know, is the next step they take the right step on a solid surface that will support them and not turn out to be black ice, quicksand, or a cynical trap? In the clean, recycled air meeting rooms of corporate workplaces and the flickering Zoom-mediated collaborations of remote product teams, we look a lot at documents and whiteboards and computer screens. It's easy to fall into thinking these artifacts are a medium, that they're the stuff we are making. But ultimately, I mean, sure, we make that stuff. But ultimately, where things actually get to the ground, our medium isn't what's on screens or what's on spreadsheets or white papers or intelligence dashboards. It's breath, blood, and bones. It's living human bodies. An organization wouldn't bother making anything if it didn't provide some kind of value. And if you trace anything an organization values all the way to the ground, you will find human bodies being impacted for good or ill. In the description for this talk, I use the word radical. I've been thinking a lot about that word for quite a while. Let me see, in my skill. Especially since around 2016, honestly. And that's when I had a bit of a wake-up call and realized I not only barely started to understand my privilege and to question the role my professional practice might have in the grand scheme of things, radicalness has a bad vibe for people with privilege. It sounds disruptive, even dangerous. Radical is often used as a pejorative in polite society. And I'm frankly, I mean, you know, I'm a pretty comfortable middle-aged white dude. I'm pretty anxious about being seen as radical in any way. I don't like sticking out that way, even though I'm pretty comfortable being kind of an oddball in lots of other ways. But I know, like in my chest, I know that power structures don't like radical anything. So I don't know. Do you want to stick your neck out? I mean, it's the insecurity that privilege often brings. But I'm not really comfortable with the state of affairs that I've been describing either. And I confess I'm a flawed vessel for this whole message. But I wonder, what would a radical information architecture look like? The etymology of radical is of or pertaining to the root, having roots. I think we have an opportunity to not just touch the ground, but dig into it and honestly consider the roots of what we do and the roots of the power structures that pay us to do it. What are we being blind? Where are we being blind to the realities of the bodies that we inevitably impact? Where are we correcting for that oversight? If we can't accurately understand how each precious human body will be changed by whatever enterprise to which we contribute our labor, how can we say that we're doing good work or not? And if that product or service or whatever is so big at such scale that there's no way to understand what impact its impact will be to the vast, beautiful variety of human bodies and human stories it touches, is that an excuse to just go ahead and do it anyway? What methods, standards, or tools are best suited to finding ground, digging into it, and changing the architecture of all this works at the root? Maybe we need to double down on ethnography. Maybe we need to find ways to track human well-being more accurately at scale. Maybe we just need to put the right people in power who can make top-down change. Maybe these are good answers. I don't know for sure. I'm barely figuring out how to ask the right questions. So I suppose think of this as a conversation starter. Where do we go from here? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Andrew, for your thoughtful presentation, and we hope to take a moment to gather our collective thoughts and maybe come back to you with some questions. So I will find the QR code screen and get that up shortly so that folks can hear that I can. I have a question from Michelle, who asks, so is the suggestion to have more user research? Are there other approaches to getting more insight around the products we build and how they affect people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Transparently and totally honestly, uh, look, this whole presentation is moderately polemical, and it's mainly just a lot of hand waving, like, oh my God, what the hell, right? So it's not like I did the hard work of figuring out how to tell you how to fix it at all. But yeah, I mean, I think that's, look, it's a big world, and so much of what I talked about really has to do with the broader context of politics and free market capitalism and all kinds of other things, right? And none of us are going to single-handedly in our job, our workplace, be like, I'm going to fix that. So we're all working within the constraints of what's going to, put food on the table and all of that. But within that, within the bubble of what you can affect, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to check in, to just keep that feedback loop and checking in with what is it that what do we really know about the people who we're going to be intervening in their lives with these products and services? And are we really being careful that we're not just seeing what we want to see? And then once we've done it, how is it affecting them? The thing is, though, that in a lot of organizations, like, if you're doing any of that, a lot of it is kind of pre-constrained to very specific questions that product wants to answer, which tend to be very surface, rather than I don't know. And a lot of times too, it's just sort of like you're constrained to only sort of investigate the things in a way that you're going to get answers that the business wants, right? And I've seen this over and over again. In the last job I had, it was happening like crazy. I was running the research team, and it was so frustrating to just hear the executives being like, yeah, but we're going to ignore that lesson that we just learned, and then turn around and bomb, when they launch a product. So partly for the success of the product, sure, but also for just really understanding, like, well, what is this doing? I mean, one thing that prompted this thinking for me was the fact that OpenAI and these other models just decided in a sort of colonist-like mentality that, well, everything that's on the web that I can see, it's out there, so I should just be able to use it however I want, and then go make money on that. And I don't know, for some of us, that just feels like a huge violation. And for a bunch of us, apparently it doesn't. And so, I think that there's an interesting philosophical, ethical question to kind of dig into there. But that was an instance where clearly somebody made a decision. I mean, it came out recently where I forget which one of these guys, maybe it was Sam Altman or whoever, but was like, well, I mean, of course we couldn't just go and get permission for all that, because we could have never done it. And that's my point is, okay, well then, then but you just decided it was okay to go ahead and do it anyway. Really? Um, it's that kind of thing that really got me going for this. But I think in our workplaces, I think, yeah, and one last thing I'll say, I do have terribly long answers, I'm sorry, but when I first started doing information architecture practice and user experience, um, I was doing it using the contextual design methodology, excuse me, which starts with that ethnographic approach, and I'm so myopic that I didn't realize that all the other people I was meeting in the broader community back in the early 2000s didn't didn't do that too. Um, but I'm still a big believer in that. Start with what's on the ground and really understand it for what it is. Yeah.
Shane, we've got a couple questions that have come in through the
Mm-hmm.
way here.
Okay. Yeah, we got a couple more on the Zoom as well, but yeah, we can go back and forth if you got a question queued up, Bob.
Yeah. What are the top 3 main guardrails that you have applied in your profession to reduce this detachment from the physical element? So how do you minimize that?
I don't know if I can come up with 3 guardrails. I will say, so for example, in my job I'm in now, which I just started in this job, and in the job I had before that, actually the last 3 jobs I had, it's just I've been more successful here than I was in the last 2 internal jobs I had. Um, I'm in meetings and I'm hearing product folks and tech folks and channel managers and whoever talking about like, well, we need to do this next, or what do we do next? And well, okay, we need to put this tool out there that allows, bankers or bank customers to do X, Y, or Z. And they're just, it's all sort of disconnected from the specificity and the situatedness of what the people actually need to do to make these workflows happen that we're designing something for. And so I just bring in the service blueprinting and I say, okay, let's do this, but let's think about these as people. This isn't a process model. We're really thinking about human beings doing stuff with their bodies in real time. Where are they when they do it? What are they touching when they do it? What are they using when they do it? How long are they waiting to get an answer? Right. Like when I was working at a big insurance company, internally they had gotten this idea that like, man, it's going to be so great if we could just get people to take photos of their car as soon as they had an accident. And I'm like, okay, you're on the highway, you just had an accident, your hand is shaking, there's people going by 70 miles an hour. You want me to do what? But this didn't come up in the conversations, right? Because it was very attractive to the organization to be like, it's going to save us money if we make the customer do that for us. So I think it's really one guardrail, but it can take many forms, which is wherever possible, I try to introduce methods and mappings and things to try to get us to like, okay, well, let's put ourselves in the shoes of these people who are doing this work or doing this thing. And that seems to help, right? But it's harder if you don't have good research, behind it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that response, and I'll queue up another one for you from the Zoom Q&A. And Bob, keep me on time here if we do need to cut things short, but I think we have 2 questions here. Have you been tracking the responsible AI movements? Are any of those headed in the right direction, or are they all just another sham? And this is from Keith.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know. I do, from what I understand, like there's one responsible AI movement that's really framed around the idea that, well, the AI is going to get too smart and we need to keep it from turning into Skynet, and some of the founder type people are doing that. But, Emily Bender and others have pointed out like some of this is just flim flam because they're really just using this as a way to kind of talk. It's a backhanded PR move in some ways. My concern isn't that IA, by the way, or AI is going to get too smart. My concern is that people are going to think it's smarter than it really is, which is exactly what just happened over the last year and a half, right? And I had that concern. I mean, I think I even put it in the book that like digital agents, things that have agency in the world that aren't people, but that can take agency and change things based on some kind of internal logic. That the way we design them is too anthropomorphized, and it tricks people into thinking that they're capable of doing stuff that they can't. And when it's just a toy, like if I'm playing the fart game with my Apple or with my Siri or whatever, or Amazon Alexa device, whatever, right? But like, you got a doctor asking it, like, what's going on in this X-ray, and then you've got another situation. So I don't agree with that. I know that there are a number of people like Emily Bender and the women that I pointed at, Timnit Gebru, whose name I'm never sure if I'm saying it right. In fact, some of the people that got fired from Google because they were trying to be responsible. I'm in their camp. I'm 100%. And so I'm kind of following what they're having to say about it. And none of them are really saying like, no, it's all bad. It's just they're saying this is all getting misused and blown out of proportion, largely for the hype, right? And the hype curve. I mean, there were responsible. I'm trying to say Bluetooth. That's not what I mean. Blockchain, people too, right? Who are like, no, here's what blockchain is actually good for. Here's responsible ways to use it. That's great. But then you had all this hype, they got all this bubble, and then a minority of people are able to cash out, and everybody else is a loser. So that's my concern with this mainly. But I'm grateful that there are people out there trying who really understand it better than frankly than I do. So maybe I shouldn't be talking about it at all. But I'm glad that there are people out there who are really trying to be responsible and real with it.
All right, so thank you for that response. I have one more question queued up, but Bob, did you have one that you wanted to interject?
I think since we're coming up on the time for the next talk, why don't we pose both the question from Roger and the one that I have here,
Okay.
and let it just sit, and then maybe it can come back during the panel discussion. So,
yeah.
And I can handle them both since I have them both here, Shane, and you only have.
Okay.
So Roger asks, you spoke at length about the importance of in-person interactions over solely virtual and database types of knowledge. Do you see any opportunities in using AR or more pervasive types of tech in helping us create stronger connections with our environments and each other, especially since we can design these things to work more in line with how humans biologically function? So that's a meaty one to think about. And then the other one is around, you included a headline about Toys R Us on the slide with other headlines being focused on tech, and just a question about expanding on that. But so that's some things to consider over the next half hour while Joe talks, and then after Joe is done, we'll have the panel with Dan and Karin having a discussion with Joe and Andrew and so forth. So
Great. Thank you.
thank you.
Wonderful. Great plan, and thanks for keeping us on track. And so with that, as hinted at, the next presenter up is Joe Elmendorf, an approach for finite humans to grapple with the infinite. And with that, I will hand it over to Joe.
Thanks, Shane. All right. Here we go. See that?